Welcome back, guys and girls. What I want to dive into today is going to be our top three podcasts for the year, just a little bit of a review into what you've seemed to enjoy the most. And I think really going a little bit deeper into the weeds as to why we thought they were really special or really valuable to share. Last week, we did the top three YouTube videos, which luckily were completely three different topics that we went through. If you haven't watched that one, I think we did a nice little breakdown of it and just allows you to really solidify, I guess, the understanding of what we tried to get through in those podcasts. If you haven't watched it, you can go back and watch them as well. So today, there's three that really have like a really strong theme, Mandy, and it's going to be kind of fun to unpack this a little bit because it's this whole discussion of like working with your body, like managing a hormonal state, looking at recovery and really appreciating it a lot more than usual, and then having a look at things like insulin resistance as well. That's going to I guess answer some questions if you feel like you're doing the right things and the body's not responding, right? So the three I want to unpack are going to be pretty fun. The first one is this discussion around the best exercise for balancing hormones. So it's a really nice way of looking at, again, if you're going to put effort into something, where should that go, and what results can we really get out of it, right? Because if you're already exercising more than twice a week, this conversation of knowing, well, where can that effort be spent is going to be an important one. If you're not at least exercising twice a week, then I think just some movement is always going to be helpful, right? And you pick whatever feels good. But really getting into that space where you're training more regularly and you're wanting to see results from the efforts you're putting in, I think it's a nice little discussion to start with. So, Mandy, this was your podcast session.
Mm.
So, really, the best exercise for balancing hormones. What is it?
Mhm. Well, pretty much just what you said. It is that balance of what I think one of the key points that I got to put across at the start of this discussion was that finding that line of enough versus too much. Because I think exercise is, and for various reasons, which we can dive deeper into, really important for balancing hormones on the whole, not just sex hormones, but insulin and stress hormones as well. But the trouble is that sometimes we can go too far with that because we think, well, I'm doing some, I need to do more. And that can be just as detrimental as doing nothing. So the point at the start of the discussion was finding that line of where's that kind of sweet spot of this is a good amount before you go over that line of too much. And then when you find that sweet spot of this is a good amount, what does that actually break down into? Because, like, if you're not even walking, then that would be the first thing that we add in. If you are already doing that and maybe you've got a whole lot of cardio that you're throwing on top of that, maybe we pull that back and swap it for some strength training. So it was kind of this step by step layer of building up through first piece of exercise for balancing your hormone is getting some steps in. Next part would be some intentional strength training for various reasons that has a really beneficial effect on um, testosterone levels and insulin sensitivity and cortisol management and whatnot. And then up from there, a little bit more output, maybe it's some hit or something like that, but kind of building up through those layers and not just kind of going to the extremes of everything or nothing.
Yeah. Before I sort of dive in there, you mentioned testosterone, and straight away I think we talk about testosterone with females quite a bit.
Mm.
Yet when it comes up, like, oh, you're talking about men. So
Mm.
how does testosterone come up for females, and why is that important to look at through weight training?
Yeah, testosterone is super important for females. Testosterone is the the key hormone that all of our other hormones come from. So women need it as well. And I think we actually have more testosterone than we have estrogen, but we just don't measure it in the same way. So it doesn't look like as much and we don't think about it as much. And some more recent research that have been diving into in the hormonal, like women's hormone menopause space, is that potentially testosterone's the hormone we lose first. So we always think about losing progesterone when we're no longer ovulating, and then estrogen declines as we're no longer ovulating and whatnot. But the first hormone to decrease might actually be testosterone. And what that feels like for a woman is this kind of drop in energy and vitality and kind of that get up and go feeling. It's that mojo bit that you kind of lose. So it is really important. But the other thing about testosterone for women is that testosterone is very anabolic. It's a growth hormone, essentially. And we think of, oh, growth hormone to help you grow muscles. Yes, but growth hormone to help recover, brain tissue or gut lining tissue or any other type of tissue that's turning over in your body and you're wanting to repair and be able to rebuild. So for people with chronic health conditions and stuff where there's an increased breakdown, the importance of testosterone as a growth hormone to help stimulate that rebuilding is so, so important. So some strength training to boost testosterone levels, to boost that feel good factor, it's hugely important.
Yeah, I'm glad I asked the question. Yeah, that sort of that space of rebuilding tissue, we think our bicep, but like when we
Mm,
really realize it's all those cells in our body, from even our gut lining to this, that, and the other, it's going to be really important to, I guess, highlight.
yeah.
With that exercise overall, I was just over in Sydney in the weekend, and actually from that summary I sent you through the other day, Mandy, Sydney's actually our second city of the most listeners
Oh,
overall. So that's kind of cool. So,
cool.
hi everyone in Sydney. But looking at that space of over there, everyone's pretty fit. There's a lot of runners. Everyone's swimming, biking, running. Uh, and I think seeing that transition for a lot of our clients, seeing a huge benefit in overall health, well-being, energy, hormonal status in introducing some sort of weight training, and in some cases actually reducing the amount of running and cycling and things that are done, is quite a shift when it's culturally quite a big thing. Like it's sunny, you want to get out and sort of run. And as we mentioned before, like some form of movement and really just feeling alive and moving and everything else. I'm always going to emphasize that and highlight and support that. But
Mm,
being able to really step back and look at what the body needs first to regenerate cells, keep things strong. And I guess some of the really cool discussions I'm having more often, and I think people are getting more educated on, certainly if they're listening to podcasts like this, is okay, I want to be able to keep running forever. So I want to keep my quads strong because that's going to be really that shock absorber to my knee so I can keep doing it. Right. So not only is it going to be helpful from a fat loss standpoint, but the longevity to certain activities like your running, cycling, etc.,
mm,
is also going to be really helpful. So
mm.
looking at that through balancing hormones, what's the shift that you were ultimately trying to get across with that video? Because I think we talk a lot about having the low intensity walks, talking about the addition of weight training, but when we're trying to look at specifically weight training, there's a stigma or there's a misconception around it's my hormones that's the problem, right? Whereas I guess for you, you're kind of associating it back to the types of things you're doing in a day, and therefore it's responding to what you're doing. So
Mm.
to what you were alluding to before, exercise can be a stressor, and that can be a good stressor or a bad stressor. But allowing it to be more specific in the type of exercise you do, well, then that can be a benefit a lot more of the time.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's kind of complex. There's so many ways to go with it. So I think just movement in general on the whole is important. So if you're not moving, we need to move. And the reason for that is that movement helps to kind of move our digestive processes and all of that. So it helps with elimination pathways. And for women in particular, especially through perimenopause when estrogen can have a real high point, elimination pathways being active and kind of moving things through is one of the key ways that we get rid of excess estrogen. So I don't really like the term estrogen dominance because I think it's slightly misconstrued. It's not estrogen dominance, it's just slightly higher estrogen compared to the amount of progesterone present at the time. But you could still have too much if you're not having regular bowel motions and not kind of excreting estrogen effectively. So movement in general like literally has a huge impact on just our ability to regulate on that excretion level. Beyond that, the strength training piece I think really comes into play in that it stimulates that kind of production of testosterone and that balance of hormones overall. Muscle that is active is more sensitive to hormonal levels. And so when I say muscle that is active, someone who's got a larger amount of body weight potentially has a higher amount of muscle mass, but it's not active. It's just maintaining. It's just there because it's needed to support the frame of the person. Whereas someone who's actually utilizing that muscle to move some weight, i.e. strength training, that muscle's active and more sensitive. So it's more sensitive to insulin, it's more sensitive to thyroid hormones, which helps regulate the whole kind of pathway of our endocrine system, so our hormonal system. And then using strength training, kind of like you said before, strength training can be the thing that can protect, doesn't allow us to continue doing the kind of training that we like. So having a decent amount of muscle allows you to be able to run or cycle better so you can stay doing those things. Where was I going with that one? I had a point to that and now I've lost it. But if you're just going to go straight to kind of like the running and the cycling and not be able to maintain the muscle mass, there's going to be a decline in what you can do over time, which means you're going to do less movement in general. So it's very protective having this kind of layers of movement and focus for it. Um, that answer the question you asked? I
I think
can't
so.
believe
Yeah, 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 for sure.
it.
I think it's just what's the overall intention of looking at that type of exercise? And I guess we're trying to always answer the questions to the uh, ultimately answer the questions we get. And I think one of the big ones is like, I'm not losing weight, but I'm doing all of this exercise, right? So for
Mhm.
you, you're going into the weeds of like, okay, so why would weight training be helpful?
Mm.
Not just from a general time constraint standpoint, but specifically how it's impacting hormonal status in order to just get more out of what you're doing, right? So
Yeah, yeah.
I think with that particular podcast, without kind of redoing it today, it becomes just a nice emphasis towards if you are noticing there's a disruption of hormones, you're noticing your body's not responding like it used to, and you're resisting the weight training that we've been harping on about for years, this might be a way to find a more appropriate ratio that is helpful for you right now. Because if it's, 80-20 cardio to weights, maybe it should be kind of the other way around and weights to cardio. And if you find that balance, certainly even in the short term, very much like how we address gut health, right? It's not that you have to remove all these foods forever, but it might be helpful to do it for 2 or 3 months and really repair some level of gut lining and digestive function and reduction in overall inflammation, that you can actually bring some of those foods in and feel significantly better than you were before, right? Because we see
Yeah.
all these people that are like everything reacts to me. I'm like, well, that's not a long term strategy by removing all food. But
Yeah,
if we
yeah.
can lock in the main ones that are causing problems, then you might be a lot less sensitive when we get things right. And I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
that's an area that really gets quite confusing and overwhelming really quickly in the gut health space, is that your gut starts reacting more and more as things get more and more damaged. So as soon as you start to repair that, you'll see less and less things react. And I think to exercise to a similar degree, if you start to really rebuild that tissue and strength and metabolic function, you can actually get away with more and still feel like you move forward. So
Mm.
yeah, I think it's a fun way to look at it. I
Mm.
think this ties in really nicely to the second podcast that came up in the top three for the year, which is the one I did with being the why the key to building muscle was being lazy. And I think this was like, as we seem to always do now, Mandy, it was kind of the psychological side to your biological aspect, talking about
Mhm.
the same thing, right? Which was
Mm.
weight training and
Mm.
looking at how to get the most out of exercise. And for me, this was a podcast where I dove a little bit more into a personal story around having to really shift my mindset around how I exercised, coming from a background of triathlons and rowing and all these sort of more endurance activities when I was 18 or 15 or whatever it might have been,
Mm.
where it was just an accumulation of reps and volume, right? If you put more time into the erg, more time into the rower, you would get more results. And ultimately, the same with what we've just talked about. Doing more and more running does not result in more and more body fat dropped. In some cases, it results in more and more body fat because the body just gets more and more stressed. So,
Yeah.
being able to see this for myself, even moving from the rowing side of things to more of a body composition goal. So I did some sort of physique and bodybuilding style shows and things for a good 5, 6, 7 years,
Mm.
and I noticed that there were certain people that would come in, do a 40-minute workout 3 times a week, and they looked better and they were getting more results than me training 6 days a week, sometimes twice a day. And I was like, hang on, I'm putting in a lot of effort here. And I
Yeah.
think, it's so easy and so many people are so quick to say, well, it's genetics or it's this, that, and the other. But realizing it was my overall mindset from a total cardio output standpoint that was simply unhelpful to a body composition goal, right? And I think knowing that training is a relationship between stimulus created in exercise and then your ability to recover from it, I was simply just digging a bigger hole than I could recover from, right? So as a little visual, I was digging a hole, kind of filling it back halfway and then digging it further down. So by the end of the week, I was so under recovered that my body was just going to hold on to body fat as a survival mechanism to not move forward. And I think that hopefully resonates with a couple of people listening to this because they put in a lot of effort, right? They look at the amount of cognitive volume they're putting in at work, how much they're running around doing errands and picking up kids and everything throughout their day. And then they're trying to add in 5 workouts or something on top. Like your body's got no chance to recover, right? Is there a recovery day in there? Is there a day to just generally replenish systems or go for a stretch or a walk as opposed to slog it again? So that for me personally was a really nice way to both help myself get more results out of less, and then also see that directly impact clients by actually moving back to a 3 times 30-minute workout a week as opposed to 6 times 2 hours.
Yeah, yeah.
um, so really, I don't know what you want to dive into there, Mandy, but I think that discussion was really close to home and also really impactful. That I think ties this whole podcast together a lot, which is we talk about educating you in many ways, but
Mm.
a lot of the times it's this assumption that what we used to do will work again, And until we question that theory and rebuild what's going to work for us now based on the general lifestyle we live, we could just be doing too much and not allowing our body to recover.
Yeah, yeah. We as humans, we just always think that if something's good, more is better,
Yeah.
right? And it just isn't the case. And I think when it comes to exercise, this is a point which it's kind of hard to wrap your head around a little bit because it requires a little bit of letting go, and it does tie exactly into the hormone balance discussion because something I said in there was that yeah, exercise is the stimulus and recovery. Exercise creates the stimulus and recovery creates the adaptation. So the benefit of exercise is realized in the recovery. It's not the exercise itself. It is important, obviously, because if you're not training hard enough, and you know what, you're not going to get as great an adaptation at the end. But the point is it requires a little bit of letting go because you have to know when enough is enough and not just chipmunk and do more, more, more because you think it's going to be better. So it is actually quite a mindset game to be able to like do your thing, know that you've done enough and stop at that point and just allow the time to kind of tick past and to focus on those recovery aspects a little bit. And I think it's a little bit of a muscle that we need to train because especially if you're a high performer or the A-type personalities where you just want to keep going and going and going, you could really be going so fast you're not really getting anywhere.
Yeah,
Um,
we've talked about this before, but I think we could probably split it perfectly down the middle of the listeners, right? Where half of you need a brake pedal and half of you need an accelerator, right? So being able to look at, well, if you're working out 4+ times a week, feel like you're constantly on the move, you don't sit down, and you're seeing that there's a little pouch of body fat around your stomach that just won't
mm,
shift, then this is that discussion for you, right? Like, let's find a brake pedal and realize that you go faster, you go further, and you feel better. It's
yeah,
just that giving yourself the ability to have an adaptation. Whereas the
mm,
other half, right, you might be in that sort of information gathering space, but not actually doing enough of the actual actions, right? We
yeah,
talked about this on episode 1, which is like, what
yeah,
are you actually doing?
yeah, yeah,
And then really putting that rubber to the road and making sure that we can then self experiment and learn and see what really works, and make sure that there are a couple workouts every now and then where you leave 10 out of 10 on the table. There's nothing left in the tank, and you know what 10 out of 10 feels like, right? And I think
mm,
every workshop we've had that aha moment on both directions, where one's like, oh, I'm just lifting tons of weight and trying to go hard, and I actually don't have to work as hard but be more specific and I'll get more out of my training, versus the other person that says, wow, I haven't been training nearly hard enough and now
yeah,
I know what hard looks like. I just need to access that. So I think there's quite a perfect split, and I think it's why we always hesitate to talk about it, because
mm,
it's quite easy to self-identify with the space that it's easier to identify with, rather than the
yeah,
opposite, right? Like, it's
yeah,
if you're a 9 out of 10 with nutrition, so many people will try optimize nutrition to get to a 9.5 out of 10, rather than realizing that their training is a 4 out of 10, and they would get a much bigger result by taking it from a 4 to a 6 out of 10.
yeah. Yes. Um, oh man, I keep losing my train of thought. Yeah,
I'm
I
the
think
one.
we
I'm the one functioning on 6 hours sleep.
yeah, yeah. You're going so many angles. I'm confused. I think I think a way to maybe measure that, because how do you know, right? This is the question. How do you know what 10 out of 10 is if you haven't felt 10 out of 10?
Yep.
But I wonder as well if a little guide there is if you go to train and you mentally don't have the capacity to really push hard ever, it never is in there, you're probably under recovered.
Hmm.
Because I think some of the time, at least, we should be able to go to do whatever training we're going to do and be like, man, I just kind of have that. I've got it in there to go hard today. But if you never feel that, it's probably a good sign that perhaps there is a bit of an element of under recovery, and maybe pulling back and focusing on quality rather than quantity is a good step.
Yeah, it is an interesting one. It's actually kind of quite a cool thread to pull in a way, because I've talked to plenty of women who say in their 20s, they're like, oh, I thought I had a good pain tolerance, and then I had kids, right? And then, like,
Mm,
what I thought was a 10 now was completely readjusted, right?
mm,
So I think it's a weird one to look at, because internally we work within the world based on current constraints, right? And you see this in general childhood discussions as well, around, like, everyone thinks they had a hard childhood, but it's based on their current version of stress. Like we all have good days and bad days, but if our bad days are a stubbed toe, that's very different than having to flee a country because of war, right? But it's still a
Mm,
hard day, right?
mm,
And I think being able to look at that both in pain and perception is such a big part of general output.
yep.
So where we see this play out a lot with people that have been had an athletic past versus otherwise, people that have previously been in team sports uh, know what it feels like to train hard. And
Mm,
to their detriment or positive outcome, there's going to be their ability to achieve it, right? So typically
mm,
that might even be a nice way to sort of self-identify first steps, right? Like if you've
mm.
come from a background of very high competitive sports, you might know what to do to push, but you might be completely underestimating recovery capacity compared to 16-year-old version of you, right?
Yeah.
Whereas if you haven't been in that team environment, and this is you sort of rediscovering the new version of you now. You want to get fit and healthy, or maybe you just never had to worry about health before because you're always lean or X, Y, and Z. That's a muscle that needs to be built, right? I.e., that
Mm,
ability to really push the body, challenge the body, and find those limits that maybe have otherwise been undiscovered. And I
mm.
think it's a really a good place to work with. Does that feel like like a nice threshold in regards to
Yeah.
exercise versus not?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point is that if you have come from that background of being pushed in a way by external forces, in a
Yeah.
team situation or something, your ability to go super hard is
Mm.
probably not the limiting factor. The
Yes.
limiting factor is your ability to know when you need to stop. I think for coming at it from the other angle, and I can speak to this personally, having come from never having really done that much physical stuff at all, it actually is a training the other way of where your top end is,
Mhm.
because your top end is your top end based on your perspective at the time, right? And you can increase it over time. So you can go to your highest level of hard one day, and then down the track, that level of where you can go to can build, like you, and it's that ability to tolerate a certain level of pain or discomfort for a longer amount of time, or mentally approach it. So I think there's both sides to it. Some people, it is actually just being able to slow down. And I know I've got a client at the moment, and she just wants to go to the gym all the time and get on the rower or get on the ski erg and blow out the cobwebs. But it's not what she needs right now. Like what she needs is to slow down. So yeah, there's definitely both sides to it there, and I think it's just being able to spot which camp are you in and come and meet in the middle a little bit, because that's where the good stuff is.
Yeah, yeah. And we've talked about the sort of personal training thing in the past where I'm not a fan of it in regards to that reliance on needing to show up to the gym for someone else, right? And that whole consistency space. I think you need to build that muscle for yourself. But where I
Mm,
do think either a well trained friend or a personal trainer or something in the short term can be very helpful to just build that
mm,
threshold, right? Like
mm,
recently we uh, increased your deadlift quite quickly by just simply being like, cool, well, form's good, let's go, let's build it
yeah,
up, right?
yeah,
And in the space of a session, we can sort of just adjust your perception of what you can truly push, right?
mm,
Because we're like, oh, that was hard. I'm like, yeah, but that was 80%. We've got more, right?
yeah,
And I think sometimes that external nudge can be a nice way to do it. And I thoroughly enjoy helping people to discover those things through a nice little pain barrier. But I do think that's where that sort of readjusting thresholds might be an external space, right? Because I always
mm,
visualize the little iceberg here. We have that sort of 20% that we access, and then there's
mm,
80% of just protective mechanism where our brain's like, oh no, I think we should stop now, right?
yeah,
But you've actually got so much more you can access if you dig in. So
yeah, yeah,
I think in many different places in life, that's a cool place to explore. But certainly, strength
yeah,
training and your ability to get the most out of 3 sessions is your ability to push that little bit harder. And I think my best analogy for this is like walk into any big commercial gym and you'll see 20, 30, 40 treadmills and you'll see 2 rows, right?
mm,
And that's a nice visual for me of how many people are happy to stand on a treadmill, walk on a treadmill for an hour to just do more volume rather
yes,
than jump on the rower and get it done in 10 minutes, right?
yeah,
Arguably more benefit long term, but it
mm,
requires that sort of blow out the cobwebs type attitude
yeah,
to really access those higher muscle unit fibers and really, lactic acid and all those painful
mm.
things, but for a very, very short amount of time.
I think the same with strength training too, right? I think it's really easy to go in and do a whole lot of sets at a lighter weight and just keep going on the reps. And
Hmm.
then eventually, at 16 or 17 or whatever, you get a little bit of a burn in the muscle and you're like, all right, done now. That's really mentally quite easy to do. But to actually pull that right back down and hit that level of I can't do another one at, 6, 7, or 8 reps or something takes a little bit more mental tenacity, I think. And people, it's really easy to avoid that. But that's kind of where you're going to get better growth, I think, and that strength.
Yeah, and again, it's kind of split down the middle, right? Which way you go. I have
Yeah.
days where I'm so worn out that it's either no exercise or something easy,
Mm, mm,
and other days where I'm like, I've only been able to do easy for a long period of time. I need to rest, otherwise
yeah.
I'm not going to be able to access high threshold stuff,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
the ability to go from just kind of getting in there at 50% every day is not as
Mm,
may not be as productive as actually resting for 3 days and then having all this energy to just dive in and really hit something a lot harder.
mm,
Yeah, I think it's a big one. So
mm,
top two, I think, really go hand in hand, right? Like how that's
mm,
going to balance hormones specifically in that space, but really overall, this concept of recovery versus stimulus
mm,
allows us to really realize those adaptations, as you said, but fat loss, muscle gain, or just general energy throughout the day is a nice ebb and flow based on knowing your personality and your general stress type, and
mm.
whether that's a brake pedal or an accelerator.
Yes.
The last one is a little bit different. It very much ties into this, but the last of our top three for 2024 being in the podcast space was how to reverse insulin resistance. And it was
Mm,
actually top one, I believe, on Spotify, but for our total sort of across all the different places you guys listen to podcasts, it was top three.
mm,
So it was pretty popular. And I think it's a space that people are getting more and more aware of around managing blood sugar and its impacts, not just as a diabetic, and being proactive towards not becoming diabetic, but also just day to day how it's going to improve your productivity, your focus, your energy, all these other things. And if that's not
mm.
you, you now know. But what do we dive into on this podcast? What was the main ideas there?
So this one, there was kind of three. We were talking about the drivers of insulin resistance. Insulin resistance being when your cells are no longer listening to that hormone insulin, and so your body's making more and more of it to try and get glucose from your blood and into your cells. And the three main drivers are inflammation, stress, and the big one that we talked about on this was actually insulin itself. And the reason we were talking about insulin being a driver of insulin resistance is that analogy which we've used before of the noisy kid, which you tune out. If you've got a high level of insulin because of exposure to a lot of carbohydrates that you're not using well, or snacking, or various things, you have this high level of insulin, your body kind of desensitizes to it, tunes it out, and so your pancreas makes more to try and get the message across.
Can you just go through
And
that story with the kid? What's that story?
yeah, so the analogy I use is it's like a little kid yelling in the background. And as a mum, I know what this is like. But when you've got a little kid kind of talking in your ear all the time and you're trying to think about other stuff, you start to tune the noise out a little bit. They're just sort of background noise, but they don't settle for that ever. They always just get louder until you have to deal with it. And so insulin's exactly the same. We tune our cells try to tune the noise out, but our pancreas will make more to get the message across. And so insulin becomes its own problem. High insulin is driving insulin resistance. And so what we were talking about on this podcast was on that episode was how we need to manage our exposures, and then we need to manage our regulation and our ability to bring it back down. And this comes through exposure, comes through nutrition timing and nutrition structure. So having whole food meals and less snacking, having a 12-hour overnight fast, those sorts of things. And then nutrition structure being focused on protein, fiber, fats rather than carbohydrates, and whole food carbohydrates rather than refined carbohydrates. And then the regulation piece is essentially exercise, again, which obviously we've been talking about here, but that whole thing of active muscle that is actually contracting hard from time to time has higher insulin sensitivity. So you're going to help bring that insulin level down. And then the other really cool one, which we haven't talked about too much, is actually HIIT training. And HIIT training, where you're doing really short, sharp, kind of going beyond that level of what you can't keep going sort of thing. The adaptation that your cells get from that is they bring more insulin receptors to the surface of the cell, which means that you become more insulin sensitive. So yeah,
Yeah,
that was
big
a short
podcast.
example of it.
That was a cool one. And I think, even having a big chat to a cousin of mine on Sunday around, again, kind of two different camps, right? Like one that's really trying to nourish their body and look after their body, and everything's gluten free and
Mm,
this, that, and the other fancy food, right? But if it's high carbohydrates 3-4 times a day,
mm,
you're just getting this massive spike that your body's not stabilizing, and insulin is becoming more and more resistant. Not through a lack of trying, but simply
yeah.
a lack of awareness of the right things. And I think to the same point we've just talked about with exercise, of uh, sort of two camps where one, if you're in a space where all you're doing is yoga and Pilates, right, which is probably triggering to a big portion of people in this group. I love both of those activities, but the best thing you can do is not more Pilates. It's go and do a weight session and strengthen some muscles because, as you mentioned, it's the place that you're going to shuttle that glucose and actually utilize it. If you've got a really, really low amount of muscle, then you're going to be in a spot where it's really, really hard
Yeah.
for you to have anywhere for that carbohydrates to go. Right, the more
Yeah.
muscle you have, the more wiggle room you really have with the donut. And
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
that's just the easiest way to put it. And
Yeah.
I think travel for me now, I don't even really think about it in regards to putting on body fat because uh, one or two extra meals of carbohydrates. I've just got somewhere for that to go, right? And we obviously have very low muscle. I see it all the time where they
Yeah.
go on a trip and they put on 4 kilos in the space of a week. That
Yeah.
takes them months to get back off because they're very, very low muscle. And I think if your only emphasis towards both dropping body fat and improving insulin itself, or just that sensitivity, is restrict, 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 and try cut out sugar, that becomes quite challenging and tiring pretty quickly.
It does. It does. Yeah. I think we have to view our muscle as our glucose sponge, essentially. That's where
Yep.
the bulk of the glucose needs to go. And I think it's something like 80%
Yes.
post meal, something like 80% of the glucose that we get from a meal, which is breakdown in carbohydrates, should go to muscle. If the muscle's not there, it goes through your liver and gets turned into fat for storage because it can't hang around in your body as glucose. So I agree 100%. The more you train and the more you build that muscle capacity, the more those kind of deviations when you're not following the exact plan. And I think this is a really interesting discussion because that's one of the things that comes up is a lot of people say, oh, I'm fine as long as I stay exactly on track. But as soon as I deviate by one meal, I have this massive spike in weight or something like that. And it's like that's a sign of too much restriction and not enough muscle mass there to be kind of mitigating those ebbs and flows. Because as a human, we should be resilient. And if we're not resilient to those changes, it's a sign that there's some work to be done, I think. So it's a really nice, yeah, way to look at it, I think.
Yeah. So I think, again, one of those podcasts that's very much worthwhile going back and checking out if you haven't gone through it, but that space of looking at you could be eating the right foods, but the lack of timing and structure throughout your day and just being able to know what a good meal looks like rather than a sort of exhausting treadmill of being like, I'm eating healthy, but nothing's changing.
Mm.
There's some really nice specifics in that one that allow you to look at. And I think the big ones, as you mentioned, are not just eating healthy, but having somewhere for that glucose to go in the first place is such
Mm.
an easy hack to just be able to get away with more carbohydrates, have more muscle mass, right?
Mm.
And we see this a lot even on the other extreme with endurance athletes, as we mentioned before, where you're doing so much exercise, but you're breaking down so much muscle tissue that over time you end up actually accumulating body fat and decreasing muscle mass. That you just start putting on weight while exercising, which doesn't make any sense at all, right? But until you dive into the weeds, you start to see why.
Mm.
Structurally, on the food side of things, and being able to allow that sensitivity to come back, there does have to be this overall discussion of just insulin controlled living and being a lot more aware of like what are those foods that come through. And our whole coach team have done this now with an awareness around, oh wow, I didn't know that food spiked me as much as it did, right? And
Ah,
otherwise, being a healthy food like a banana or a oats or muesli type thing might be something that one person's okay with, the next person it just shoots your insulin through the roof. So
yeah.
being able to bring that sort of more intuitive or self experimentation discussion or confidence to the forefront, I think is a really, really nice way to just really build your personal nutrition plan, not just have a list of foods that you see as healthy, because
Mm.
they will, or at least may respond differently.
Yeah, just because it's a good food doesn't necessarily mean it's a good food for you all the time. And I think we saw this come through back when paleo really had its heyday and everyone was just living on, dates and maple syrup and turmeric. Like, yeah, maybe they're a whole food, but there's a whole lot of carbohydrates going on there that really needs to be balanced out with some fiber and some protein and whatnot. So, and then the meal timing thing I think is hugely important because the term clean eating, which I don't really like, but you can eat as clean as you want. But if you're eating all day and eating too much, it's still going to be too much,
Yeah.
and it's a really big drain on your insulin sensitivity and whatnot. If you're poking food in all the time.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. It's always this balance, and I think this is hopefully where I always love the podcast format because we're able to explore or communicate that context piece, right? It's so easy to get so much information online, but without context, it becomes really confusing and overwhelming really quickly. So, this is where I thoroughly enjoy the clients and the listeners that go through our podcast, because that allows us to just really spend some time in the middle with context rather than just more information. And hopefully today's kind of done that for you as well.
Mm.
I think I'm getting a little bit of static throughout the podcast, so hopefully that wasn't too disruptive listening, but it was too good to stop. So we'll, I think maybe, I don't know about your weather down Nelson Way, Mandy, but it's a little bit rainy here now. So maybe it's weather
It's
based as well.
it's just come in and there was some thunder.
Oh, there you go. Thunder,
Mm.
thunder, thunder and lightning. Very, very frightening. That's the one.
Yeah.
Cool team. Well, I'm going to leave that one there. Again, that's a bit of a nudge back to some of the podcast episodes over the last 12 months that I think would be worth looking at. And hopefully, just if you have listened to them, probably a nice reminder of some of those really key points that we wanted to get across. There's those two camps being, you're training too hard and we need to be more lasered in on what's going to really get you the goals you're after in 2025. Or two, let's blow up the cobwebs and work a little bit harder. And the Pilates yoga, keep that there, but let's train some muscles, create some stimulus, and really get you strong and see all of those impacts to both your insulin sensitivity, your sex hormones, and everything in between. I think you're going to really find a better balance and more confidence and strength to come with it. So until next time, I hope that one's a nice little focus for you, and we'll see you on the next podcast.